politics of aid, the US has just cut millions of dollars in military assistance to Pakistan. It says Islamabad is not doing enough to fight armed groups. So is Washington using aid as a foreign policy tool? And what are the consequences? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. The United States says Pakistan is failing to take action against armed groups, including the Taliban. Washington says some of them operate within Pakistani borders, and it wants the government of new Prime Minister Imran Khan to do more. It also says it will end a planned $300 million military assistance. It's part of a broader cut in US aid to Pakistan, which was announced earlier this year. Pakistan's foreign minister says the $300 million figure is money the US owed the country for its help in fighting armed groups. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is expected to visit Islamabad on Wednesday, and the issue is likely to top the agenda. President Donald Trump has previously accused Pakistan of deceiving the US while receiving billions of dollars in aid. Pakistan denies it gives safe haven to any armed group. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, let's have a closer look at the figures. Pakistan is estimated to have received more than $33 billion in financial support from the US since 2002. Washington substantially increased its assistance to Islamabad in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Then it went up again in 2009 when Congress approved a package that authorized an estimated $7.5 billion in aid over 5 years. But that lucrative financial support has drastically fallen in recent years, especially since Donald Trump came to office. Well, let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Islamabad is Symbol Khan, a security analyst. In Washington, D.C., Aparna Pandey, director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute. And also in Islamabad is Musharraf Zaidi, a political analyst and development practitioner. A very warm welcome to the program. Ms. Khan, let me start with you in Islamabad. Just how damaging are these cuts to the powerful military's capabilities, to their operation against armed groups?
I think more than the cuts being damaging to the military's capacity to carry out anti-militant operations that they have been in Pakistan's tribal areas, I think more damaging than that is the damage to the relationship, the diplomatic damage to the relationship, and kind of bringing rancor and an unpleasant touch to the first very important visit, because we've just had elections in Pakistan. We have a new government, we have a brand new prime minister who's elected to the office for the first time, and we were hoping that this would be a moment to kind of reset relations. We've seen that Pakistan-US relations have been on a downturn last year especially, and there was a hope that things could be put to a right track. But even before the Secretary Pompeo's visit and Secretary Mattis's visit to Pakistan happened, this has created a little unpleasantness and bad blood. The military is carrying on operations, and I think within Pakistan there is a understanding and a clarity here that these operations are only being conducted for Pakistan's own benefit, for Pakistan's own kind of ideas about what we need for our defense of our border areas with Afghanistan, what we need long term, what we need internally, and how we look at external security. So I think these will be continued, and the military has its own long term plans on that. I don't think this $300 million cut is going to substantially change those plans.
Okay.
Those plans are going to continue, and I know it's a difficult position, but they will continue.
Ms. Pandey, what do you make of that? Ms. Khan is talking about a sort of there was hope for a resetting of relations, but is that what this US administration is actually doing or trying to do, reset the relations by withholding money?
In monetary terms, the amount is not much, and the money was actually suspended as of January of this year. What is important, however, is the message that the US is trying to send. The bottom line is the American side believes that Pakistan has not been keeping its promises. Pakistan has acted only against those terror groups that operate inside Pakistan. It has consistently refused to act against those terror groups that operate against Americans and Afghans in Afghanistan or against India inside the country. And so with all due respect to my friend from Pakistan, they don't seem to understand that, that in the US it is not a question of, the old arguments, it's not an issue of litigating history, but a matter of trust. It is one thing to say that I cannot do this because it is against my national interest. It is another thing to say that I will do it, which Pakistan was saying all these years, and now to protest that you are not getting paid for not doing something you are not doing.
Mr. Zaidi, what do you make of that? And is it productive or counterproductive to get a country to do what you want by cutting financial assistance?
Well, if you hear the Americans, friends like Aparna and many others in Washington and in India and indeed in Afghanistan, if you hear them tell the story, they've never been able to get Pakistan to do anything. Whether they've provided the billions and billions of dollars, the tap of US dollars that was open as a free-for-all for military dictators in this country over 3 generations, the 1960s, the 1980s, and the 2000s. Or when you shut down the aid, like in the 1990s, or what appears to be what's happening now with this symbolic sort of announcement right before the arrival of Secretary Pompeo, whether you provide Pakistan with all kinds of money or you provide Pakistan with nothing, whether you hold Pakistan's hand and tell it how great it is, which the Americans have done intermittently throughout their history, or you chide Pakistan and put out sort of, newspaper stories in the New York Times and particularly in the Washington Post saying how bad Pakistan is, ultimately Pakistan ends up doing what Pakistan wants to. So I think what probably a lot of folks around the world need to look at is the relationships that Pakistan is in where other countries are able to get Pakistan to do what they want Pakistan to do. And most of the time, the way that happens, like with any other country, is when other countries align their strategic interests and their security interests with the interests of the party that they're interested in. If people are interested in getting Pakistan to act in other people's interests in Afghanistan, then they have to give some attention and consideration to Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan as well.
Ms. Khan, what do you make of that? I mean, the defining issue of the US relationship with Pakistan is Afghanistan. What is all of this, the withholding of military assistance, the souring of relations, going to mean for Pakistan's relationship with the Afghan Taliban? And is the US losing the leverage that it has through Pakistan with the Afghan Taliban by cutting this funding?
I think the relationship, US-Pakistan relationship over the issue of support to Taliban or the sanctuaries of Taliban, at least that's what the US and others have accused Pakistan of having, sanctuaries of Taliban on Pakistan's side, has always been a sticking point in this relationship last 17 years since after 9/11 and the US intervention. That has always been the case, and it has put the relationship under strain at various points. This is not the first time. But I think what is changing, and which is interesting this time around, is usually what the leverage that US had tried to use, or the tools that US had tried to use to kind of pressure Pakistan, were more security related impacts. I mean, there used to be far more drone strikes suddenly, there used to be far more border heating up, border skirmishes before that, and various other kinds of pressure was put, more like security centric pressure was put around. But I think globally we are seeing a change that since President Trump's last year's security policy has come out, there is a more of a desire to kind of use economic means and measures which are considerable. US has considerable economic might also. We keep forgetting that US has looked like as a great unilateral military power in the world, but it has a huge economic clout also globally. And we see US using that economic clout now as far as sanctions with Iran is concerned, Russia is concerned, even in the trade bilateral discussion with China. So I think Pakistan also, this is the kind of a trend that we see going forward. We've seen Secretary Pompeo's kind of not very unwelcome comments on the IMF, Pakistan going to the IMF, and that America being a big contributor to IMF is going to have a veto or say in it. And then now suddenly kind of coming out with this 300 million aid. As Musharraf has said before, nobody was really expecting this CSF funding to come out at this moment. But there is this kind of a symbolism of putting economic pressure on Pakistan, because as you may know, the new government has come in. Pakistan is in a bit of an economic crunch as far as balance of payments are concerned. Economy is not doing too bad. Pakistan has been growing 5.4% last few years, which has been tremendous, because we've gone through a whole period of internal insecurity and terrorism. So coming out of that, Pakistan has been growing 5.4% yearly. GDP is good. In the internal market is very good. But there is an economic crunch, and I think the US is kind of emphasizing the economic relationship and how that globally counts, not just with Pakistan. So it's interesting to watch that there's a different tonal impact of how US is dealing with Pakistan.
I do want to put that same question to Ms. Pandey and hear what you think. I mean, how much leverage does Pakistan have with the Afghan Taliban? Again, Afghanistan is the key issue in this relationship. And what will, what will the sort of cutting of funding mean for how much Pakistan cooperates with the US when it comes to the Afghan Taliban?
Actually, I have 3 pointed on. So one is the question of interests and goals. I mean, if you look at it, what does the United States and what does Afghanistan or any of the regional countries seek in Afghanistan? A stable Afghanistan, which is not influenced by groups like the Afghan Taliban or the Haqqani network. On the other hand, what does the Pakistani military intelligence establishment support? The Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani networks. So there are no shared goals there, there are no shared interests. And this has been a repeated pattern in US-Pakistan relations, going back decades, that the two sides have never shared goals, have never shared interests. They have temporarily just been together for certain tactical reasons. Second, the question of leverage. The United States has provided over $33 billion in aid and reimbursement to Pakistan and assistance, and has helped Pakistan in its almost 17 times that Pakistan has gone to the IMF for a program. All of those programs, actually, only one program was actually implemented fully by Pakistan. The third point, which is that how much of influence does Pakistan have over the Afghan Taliban? I am one of those who believes it has tremendous influence, but the question is, does it want to use it? Pakistan has preferred not to use it or claims it does not have it because from Pakistan's point of view, an Afghan Taliban or led Afghanistan, just like a Mujahideen led Afghanistan, helps its regional interests, which are trying to contain or put down India. So we have to look at the point of view that what does Pakistan want and how divergent is Pakistan's interest from the interest of Afghanistan, the interest of the United States and India.
Okay, I do want to broaden the discussion out now because US President Donald Trump has cut aid to a number of countries in recent months. He's ended all funding for the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency that provides schooling and healthcare to 5 million people. It denied Egypt almost $100 million in aid and is holding back another $195 million until it sees what it calls improvements in Cairo's record on human rights and democracy. And Washington withdrew military assistance from Myanmar over that country's crackdown on a Muslim Rohingya in Rakhine State. So we're seeing, Mr. Zaidi, do you think that we are seeing the US or this US administration use funding, whether it's military funding or humanitarian aid, as a political tool in a way that previous US administrations might not have?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to zoom out and broaden this even further. I think the first thing to understand and appreciate is that foreign assistance, whilst almost overwhelmingly ends up benefiting people that deserve it and tends to be, at least from the view of the taxpayer that's providing that funding, is genuinely a benevolent act, an act of compassion and humanity. But the way in which foreign assistance and international aid is often programmed and the way it's directed and funneled is often informed by political objectives. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. The countries that provide aid to other countries are looking to achieve strategic and or tactical objectives. So there's nothing wrong with the U.S. choosing to use its money in whatever way it deems necessary. I think the question for a country like Pakistan or any other country that is a net recipient of aid is whether or not that country knows what it wants and whether or not that country then can channel the aid in the direction that it feels is best for its interests. So I having worked in international assistance and international aid myself for many, many years, I've never found either a donor country or the recipient country at odds, because in at least the work that I've done most recently, for example, with the Alif Elan campaign, which we just closed last week, we always found that both the UK, DFID, which was providing the funding, and the Pakistani government, which was in many ways the target of that funding, there was never any sort of, lack of coherence or
But I think if you're talking about, one of the examples that
so I think
we've
a lot of
noted,
it.
Right, but if you're talking about, say, the example of the US administration cutting aid to the UN agency that's responsible for Palestinian refugees, there is a complete difference in what the US administration is asking for and what the Palestinians see as being fit. Ms. Khan, the Palestinian leadership have said that the US administration is actually using its humanitarian aid as blackmail, and that it's not going to force them to the negotiating table. If we look at this case, how do you see the US cutting funding to the agencies that are in charge of looking after Palestinian refugees and the response to it?
I think there's a big difference, as we were talking about military CSF, which is Coalition Support Fund, which is more military aid for military to carry on its operations. I think comparing it to humanitarian aid, it's an absolutely different thing. Humanitarian aid goes to people to sustain themselves who have been, whose livelihoods, shelter, food, nutrition, water, all that access is denied. It's basically a matter of life and death. So
we're not saying that they're the same thing, but we are talking about, exactly, we're talking about the US using aid, whether it's humanitarian or military.
It's absolutely condemnable. No, I think it's completely condemnable, and I think it's showing a very kind of a heartless way of doing foreign policy, and it's surprising because U.S. has stood for rights and freedoms and support for oppressed people around the world. I mean, that's how we've looked at the U.S., and it's actually a huge negative to their own image and to their own international multilateral image to do this. But I don't think that there's a parallel with the military aid that we are talking here. But I don't know any other words but to condemn it.
And Ms. Pandey, what do you think of what the US is doing, say, with the case of cutting aid to Palestinian refugees? Do you think that they're actually serious about wanting to negotiate with the Palestinians because it's not having that impact? Are they trying to use aid as a political tool in this case?
I actually do not work on the Middle East, on Israel or Palestine, so I will not be able to answer that part of the question. I would much rather touch on what you had mentioned about the aid being cut to Egypt. So countries that have been military or security allies of the United States, whether it is Egypt, or it is Pakistan, where, or in the case of Burma, where they're trying to cut aid, Myanmar. One may disagree with how it is done, but one will try. But if you try and look from the American point of view, the aim is to send the message that we cannot keep providing you aid, security aid, and military assistance on the grounds that you promised that you would do something, but you are not doing it. And so maybe cutting off aid is the way to either see whether or not we share any interest still, or to make you do something which you said you would do, but you have not done up till now.
But in the cases of Egypt, cutting funding because they say they have concerns over their human rights, democracy, in Myanmar over that government's attacks on the Rohingya, would you say that that's made any difference at all if you look at Egypt's sort of human rights and democracy record now, or the fact that Myanmar is completely, denying all of the allegations against its government for its treatment of the Rohingya?
I mean, All I would say is that sometimes instead of giving money, it may be a good way to check whether or not you have any leverage. If I don't have leverage, why should I give good money after bad? And if I do have leverage, maybe my cutting off money will lead you to rethink.
Okay, I want to put the Palestine question to Mr. Zaidi as well, because you do work in development. You know, there are so many people that have said for a long time that this aid actually excuses the Israeli authorities as an occupying power to provide for Palestinians, and that aid money is keeping this sort of status quo of occupation in place. So could cutting aid actually have unintended positive consequences in the long run?
I think there's been a lot of sort of analysis and research that looks at sort of the potential downsides of AIDS and the way in which, not just in the Palestinian example, which is obviously more stark, and I think it evokes much deeper and stronger emotions, particularly for people that care about how other human beings are treated. But I think in terms of aid itself, there's a lot of arguments that suggest that aid is largely an instrument to sustain the elite capture that so many of these developing countries are susceptible to and victims of, because instead of forcing governments and states to make difficult choices, aid basically papers over those dysfunctions and those imbalances in the economy and in the fiscal realities of a country. I think Pakistan might serve as a really interesting case study, because as Aparna mentioned, Pakistan has repeatedly gone to the IMF. Pakistan has been an aid recipient for most of its existence. And yet what's really interesting is that everybody keeps coming back. And you know, the rates of the loans keep decreasing. It never seems to end. So clearly, in terms of leverage, there is something about Pakistan that the United States has, and I disagree with Aparna. She mentioned earlier that it's only been a tactical relationship. But when the Mujahideen were being supported by the United States, were being feted and celebrated at the White House, Pakistan was a key partner. So was Israel. So was Egypt. You know, India was obviously left out in the cold back then. But, you know, at that time, the U.S. and Pakistan were very much strategic partners, and they sought and achieved strategic aims, including the defeat of the Soviet Union and its various allies. So I think aid is obviously always has a political dimension to it. And I think it's up to the countries that are receiving as much as it is to the countries giving to determine how it's best used.
Okay, Mr. Zaidi, we don't have long left in the program, and I would like to put those points, those very important points, to both Ms. Khan and Ms. Pandey. Ms. Khan, let me start with you. Do you think that this sort of new US strategy is going to work in the long run in its important relationship with Pakistan?
I don't think so. I think there are going to be resets and changes. It's this strategy for me is a temporary negative downturn.
Okay.
The relationship has been on a downturn, but I think this economic strategy of trying to use aid as a leverage, it's more of a show in trying to show that at least something has been done.
Okay, Ms. Khan, I apologize, but we only have about a minute left, and I would like to give Ms. Pandey the last word. You have about 30 seconds on this.
I do believe that we should give this policy a chance. We've tried everything else, from massive amounts of economic aid, military aid, to sort of cutting off aid. Maybe cutting off aid will achieve something on both sides. Maybe Pakistan will rethink its interests. Maybe the US will rethink what it wants from Pakistan. So why not give it a try?
All right, Ms. Pandey, thank you very much. And thank you all for your very interesting views on this subject. Symbol Khan in Islamabad, Aparna Pandey in Washington, D.C., and Musharraf Zaidi also in Islamabad. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.